We are especially joyful this morning to welcome the Reverend Mark Elsdon to this big conversation. And I want to just take a few minutes to share with you some life-giving ministry endeavors that Mark is involved in as a context for our conversation today. Mark is the co-founder of Rooted Good, which is a collective that supports innovative church leaders working in areas such as property development, money and mission alignment, and social enterprise. And I know Mark will help us to understand how those terms live in the world as he shares conversation with us. Mark is also the executive director at Press House in Madison, Wisconsin on the University of Wisconsin campus. He led a transformation of Press House from a dormant nonprofit into a growing, vibrant, multi-million-dollar organization. Mark has also served as a principal at Threshold Sacred Development and as past president of the board of directors of Working Capital for Community Needs, which is an impact investing fund that provides microfinancing for the working poor in Latin America. So for those of you who are not familiar with these kinds of innovative projects, Mark is a master at developing those kinds of projects. He holds a BA in psychology from the University of California, Berkeley, a Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary, and an MBA from the University of Wisconsin School of Business. Most of us have met Mark through his writing, through his two books. His first was published in 2021 and is entitled We Aren't Broke, Uncovering Hidden Resources for Mission and Ministry. And this book deals with the uses of faith-based property and investments for social enterprise and impact investing. And his second, much more recent book, Gone for Good, Negotiating the Coming Wave of Church Property Transition, collects essays from theological, legal, pastoral, financial, and historical perspectives to help us understand how we may best steward our church property assets, centering on the hope that with the right partners and just a little bit of imagination, churches can sell or transform buildings in ways that benefit the entire community. Mark is donating 100% of author proceeds from the sale of his books to nonprofit organizations that are engaging in creative solutions concerning all of these issues that I've just lifted up. I would remind you that his presentation is being recorded and will be available on the PSEI website shortly after today's meeting. The website address is PSEI lowercase.net. And you can find his presentation on the front page of our website by clicking the Big Conversations tab. So with that context-setting introduction, I will welcome you, Mark, to our meeting.
Thanks. It's good to be here with you all. I am coming to you from Madison, Wisconsin, so just a little bit north of you. Let me see. I think I can share my screen here. Let me get that started. And does everyone be able to see that okay?
Yes.
Great. All right. So yeah, I'll talk for a little bit here about some of these ideas that were actually quite nicely introduced. Thank you. And then we'll have, I think, a few minutes for some question and answer and sort of take your lead on that. So let's just dive in. So I am a pastor, a nonprofit leader, And I'm very aware of this narrative of scarcity that dominates much of our thinking in the church. Many Christian churches and related institutions in the United States are facing an imminent crisis or at least struggling. Attendance is down, giving is declining, churches are closing, and buildings are being sold at an incredible pace. There seems like articles about that just about every day. And at the same time, climate change, wealth inequality, and racial tension are massive problems facing our communities. Many churches are struggling to respond to these challenges. We're beginning to see people are no longer drawn to traditional church services and programming in the ways they once were. And I think we learned that the pandemic accelerated all of these trends, which leaves us often feeling broke, exhausted, powerless to do much about it all. We continually try to do more with less, with fewer people, fewer dollars, fewer churches. But what I want to suggest today is that there is a hope in a future. And by God's grace and in community together, we can transform neighborhoods and address injustice and inequality and sustain effective ministry during a time of major change. Because I believe that we aren't, in fact, broke. We have much, and there is much to do. Let me start with a story about a young heroin addict who I will call Peter. So Peter had almost died of an overdose in the past. His life had been derailed, and he had hurt many of the people who loved him most. But he was also back in school as a student at the University of Wisconsin in Madison for the second time with a chance to finish and graduate. The question was there any hope of escape? And what, if anything, could a church do to help? It turns out a church could do a lot. So Peter was living in a sober housing program run by Press House, the Presbyterian campus church where I do serve as executive director, when his latest relapse occurred. Our staff and other residents held him accountable to the recovery plan that he had put in place for himself and supported him through the setback. And this time it worked. With the help of his next step roommates and other resources, Peter moved deeper into his journey of recovery. He began to find success in school and make meaningful friendships on campus. Hope was reborn. Peter ended up graduating from college with a 3.5 GPA and a degree in computer engineering. He took a job at a well-known company. He mended relationships with many of those he had hurt while using heroin. He served as a peer mentor in the Next Step program and an officer in the campus recovery student organization. He even ran a marathon. And most importantly, he was sober. And Peter is not the only one. About 80% of the participants in the Next Step Sober Housing Program at the Press House Apartments over the years have either graduated from degree programs, remained sober, or both. At a time when the opioid crisis is wreaking havoc on communities all over the country, this program has saved lives and has saved Wisconsinites more than $1 million in costs associated with addiction. And at a moment when many churches are struggling to figure out what role to play in our world, Press House was truly there for Peter and his friends. What may be most remarkable about all of this is that Peter's life was transformed by living in an apartment building that was built by a campus church. It was built on an underutilized church-owned parking lot and financed with an impact investment from church-related funds. Of course, I know all this because I parked in that parking lot on my first day as a pastor about 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, actually this summer, my spouse, Erica Liu, and I were called to Madison for our first pastoral position at a seminary. When we arrived at Press House, we found a historic ministry that had declined to the point where there were 0 students involved, not a single one, and a beautiful old building that was in dire need of repair. I was actually fixing the toilets with paper clips just to keep them functioning during that time. When the first student I met wandered in asking about what happened at Press House, I had to answer honestly, nothing. Nothing's happening here at all, I told him, but we'd love for you to join us in helping to start something new. And so we set out to rebuild the ministry. But we needed new funding sources. We were spending down our endowment funds at an unsustainable pace. Our building was literally falling apart around us. Faithful donors gave just $10,000 per year, and even less was available from the denomination. It wouldn't be long before we ran out of money. So we tried something new, risky, and perhaps a bit radical. Our board of directors had updated a long-held vision to build student housing on the parking lot next to the historic Press House Chapel. So at the same time as we were redeveloping the ministry or restarting the ministry, we also set about to design this 7-story apartment community right in the heart of the university. After millions of decisions and a year of design and a year of construction, and obviously I'm vastly oversimplifying this story, we ended up opening this facility in the summer of 2007, and it is home to about 230 residents living right in the heart of the University of Wisconsin in Madison on church-owned property. You can see in this video, hopefully, a little bit of the image of the building next to the historic church building. So I'm going to let that video finish here so I can continue. There we go. So providing this purposeful and supportive living environment at Press House, we did this not to become a landlord and not to sort of develop property, but we did this in order to serve students, all right? Students like Peter and thousands more. And we do have Sunday worship every week, and that is central to our mission. But we've gone much deeper and wider with our ministry now as a result of this residential ministry that we can offer. So we're now transforming areas of students' lives that previously we were absent from. Starting with 0, we now serve about 1,000 students and young adults each year through worship, large campus events, small groups, and intentional communities in the apartments. And we found a sustainable way to pay for this work. While donor funds are still essential to accomplishing our mission, our earned income has completely changed the financial calculus and funded our growth. Because our overhead is covered by rental revenue, 100% of every donated dollar directly supports students. And our budget has grown from about $150,000 annually in 2004 to about $2.5 million today. Most powerfully of all, the mission outcomes and the financial outcomes are intimately and fully integrated. So success in mission, success with the way we serve students leads to success financially, and the reverse is also true. We have reconnected money to mission and mission to money. We recently refinanced our property with funds from the PSUSA, the UCC, and the ELCA building and loan funds, which means that instead of involving a bank, the church, those church entities, are providing the capital for our operation, and we are paying back a financial return so those denominational funds can use the money to create more good in other places. This is an example of impact investing, investing resources not simply for financial returns, but also for mission impact. So in this case, instead of investing in Facebook and Google and Amazon and so on, the funds that are lent to Press House are invested in our social enterprise. A social enterprise I refer to as some sort of activity that has a social good, but that also generates revenue. The flow of money stays in the family, so to speak. So with housing built on church land and financed with church impact investment, we are able to provide a financial return back to the larger church and at the same time transform the lives of thousands of students. Now, I'm not suggesting this exact model of development and investment can or should be replicated everywhere. Press House is just an example. In fact, I'm really not a fan of models at all. I think it's more helpful to think about ideas and examples and then apply them in our own setting. But I do invite us to expand our ecclesial and economic imagination in this moment. For there is real potential to put the dynamic power of social enterprise to work alongside the sustaining fuel of church-owned capital assets like property and land and buildings and investments for lasting innovation and transformation in our churches and communities. And these tools are available to us right now in the church today. We aren't, in fact, broke. So our story at Press House highlights 3 opportunities that kind of converge in this moment that we are living in right now. First, many congregations are struggling to figure out how to fund their operation and the mission. Participation and membership are in decline, which means budgets are shrinking even as costs of maintaining property rise. The financial model of the past, based on giving through an offering plate, is no longer sustainable in many settings. Some churches are experimenting with and finding new financial models. Others will have to sell or redevelop their property. As one of the authors writes about in my new book, Gone for Good, as many as 100,000 church buildings will be sold or repurposed in the next decade. That could be as many as a quarter to a third of all church properties. And this transitioning is happening in every corner of the country. No area and no denomination is immune. So what new uses can we envision for our property, and what new economic models will emerge for congregations? Second, congregations are trying to figure out what it means to even be a church today. Attendance is down almost everywhere, and I would argue it's never been a great way to measure real impact in people's lives anyways, attendance on a Sunday. But the decline in participation does, however, indicate that people are not connecting with what congregations have traditionally done or offered. This isn't a reflection on our failure as a church, but on shifting cultural and social realities. It's a little bit like the moment in the early 2000s when Blockbuster video stores suddenly went out of business because people started engaging with movies differently and getting them via Netflix and then streaming them. Fewer people just simply want to attend Sunday morning worship services and Wednesday evening youth groups. This does not mean that God is declining or God is going away, and people still want to engage in things that are meaningful to them. They still want experiences of the divine, and some people will still want those traditional forms of church, but fewer of them than in the time period we often compare to, kind of the mid-20th century, the 1950s and 60s. So it is worth asking ourselves, what does it mean for a church to be a transformative presence in a community today? What does it mean to be the gathered people of Christ in a community today? What forms can and should our ministry take in this moment? And third, at the same time as these other realities, we are facing some very serious and complex problems in many of our communities. Our neighborhoods are dealing with opioid addiction and food insecurity, a lack of living wage jobs, the effects of climate change, and more. Some congregations are taking notice that their buildings are often built on land that was taken from indigenous people many, many years ago. And we realize that much of the founding wealth in historic denominations, including the PSUSA, was extracted through slavery many years ago. Churches are asking themselves, how do we be the church in the midst of these systemic and complex problems, these things that our neighborhoods and our neighbors and our loved ones are facing day in and day out? Now, I don't think the situation is all doom and gloom. Far from it. A thoughtful social enterprise using church-owned assets has the potential to address all three of these realities in a sustainable and mission-focused manner. Churches have enormous resources. We know how to build community and connect people. We know how to do community organizing, even if we don't call it that. Yes, many are shrinking, but we are still rich with wonderful, committed people that have a wide array of gifts and talents to offer. We draw upon beautiful, centuries-old traditions and have proven to be resilient during all manner of social change across the eras. And we have very valuable property and investment assets. Even before the pandemic, most church buildings were in use less than 12% of the week. That's a vastly underutilized resource. And collectively, we own billions of dollars of invested assets in between congregations that have endowments and seminaries and affiliated colleges, foundations, the pension fund, and other entities. The PSUSA alone has billions of dollars of invested assets, plus enormous amounts of property. So it may be true that giving is down, but when accounting for the value of land and investments, there may be more money in the church than ever in history. We just need to put those assets to use differently than before. Creative expressions of mission and ministry are happening all over the country using church property and investment assets differently. So I work half-time with Press House, and my other half-time role, as noted in the opening introduction, is as the co-founder of Rooted Good. Rooted Good is a national nonprofit that helps churches and church-related institutions use their property to generate revenue through new expressions of ministry, or social enterprise, as we call it. Through my work at Rooted Good, I've watched churches around the country go through our Good Futures Accelerator course and come out the other side with all kinds of incredible ideas for the use of their buildings and land that is extending their ministry into the community in new and powerful ways and generating new revenue for the church. So this self-paced course includes printed materials, discussion guides, games, video content, books, and more. and it leads church leadership teams through a proven process that gets them to a social enterprise idea using their buildings or land that's relevant in their own context. Here are some examples. Congregations are serving young entrepreneurs by converting fellowship halls into co-working spaces, drawing people into community who would never attend a worship service. They're organizing co-op grocery stores to address food deserts in their neighborhoods in a sustainable way. They're opening childcare centers for teenage mothers. They're putting tiny houses on underutilized church land in order to provide homes for homeless neighbors. They're creating lawn care services, bike shops, music venues, and fair trade stores. Or they're building housing, sometimes for students, sometimes for seniors, sometimes for lower income neighbors who've been priced out of the market. Churches that have gone through our program are generating $20,000 per year, $100,000 per year, or even more, while creating new ministries that are reaching people in new ways. Every church that started a project out of the accelerator course has increased their income at some level. We were thrilled that in our pilot group of 25 churches, 88% said the Good Futures course was very or extremely helpful in seeing new possibilities for how their property can further their mission, and almost 80% said it was helpful in understanding how it could generate new revenue streams. One participating church told us they started the course focused on how to use their underused space. They said, we've got too much space, how could we use it? Then they shifted to thinking about how to make use of the space to make some money, which is fine and natural. Then they shifted to thinking about how to use the space to make money and expand their ministry impact. And that was the moment that was most fantastic, because ultimately it is the mission that matters most. Out of our experience working with churches in this way, we've developed a suite of other tools and guides that expand confidence and capacity and lead congregations through decision-making around how to rent well, how to develop well, how to sell well. And I just want to pause and let you know that Rooted Good has a partnership with the PSUSA that will make a customized PSUSA version of the Good Futures Accelerator course and all of these how-to guides available to every Presbyterian church who wants them in the United States. The accelerator is currently available, and the PSUSA versions of the how-to guides will be ready by General Assembly this summer, so keep an eye out for that. Let me say a quick word about the rural church context. There is actually a chapter in the Gone for Good book about rural churches. I think we have to be honest and admit that some of these sorts of enterprises and developments are a little bit harder to create in rural communities for a variety of reasons. Just as rural communities closing post offices and schools, our churches are getting caught up in demographic and social changes that are far beyond our ability to influence. But churches in rural communities are experimenting with their own interesting approaches to the use of church property. They can retain their role as community hubs in new ways. So every time I talk to folks, I hear new ideas people suggest about how to do this and what fits in their context. And here are some of the ones I've been hearing recently. So some churches are experimenting with installing electric car chargers in their parking lots if they're near an interstate as a way of providing sort of hospitality and generating some income. Others are partnering with healthcare systems to use underutilized church space as a part-time health clinic in locations where healthcare is needed, but building a standalone health center is not viable or necessary. Some churches are looking at building small senior living communities on church land so that neighbors can age in place in their hometown and not have to move away to sort of a bigger city to find supportive living options. So much of this conversation around the future of the church is filled with loss and sadness. And that makes sense, that's understandable. It's important for us to pause and to celebrate the past and to grieve the changes and not just rush past that. But this is also a moment of extraordinary opportunity. The Christian story is one of death and resurrection, of new life and a new future. Mike Mather, a pastor in Indianapolis, has said, we can't do anything with what we don't have, but we do have something. We do have something. There is property in the church. There is money in the church. And more important than all that, there are incredible people in the church. So I would argue that there's no better time for us to dream big and take some risks with the somethings that we have. For really, what is there to lose at this point? Members and buildings? The old model has taken us well down that path already. Now is the opportunity, the time to dream big, to take some risks, to trust God and each other. Now is the time to try something new in new ways with the abundance of resources that are available to us. I will stop there and we can have a little bit of conversation. So I'm not sure if anyone has, if you all have a process you'd like to follow for sort of Q&A, or if you want me to just take them via the chat, or people raise their hand, you let me know.
If you would like to pose a question or comment, you can raise your electronic hand or you can put notes in the chat either. And Mark will take them in sequence. Yeah, Nate, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm working with having conversations with a lot of rural churches, and so I really appreciated the section that you talked about with that. One of the things that we bump up against a lot is energy. Like it's one thing to dream big, but it's another thing to have the energy to put it into place. What are some life-giving energy things, ways that we can get people to be more generative and engaged, especially when they're older and feeling that they're also in decline?
Yeah, that's totally fair and real, right? One response to that is that I think we often believe we need to do more of this ourselves than like all of it ourselves. So we're really good in the church at, shoveling the snow with all, our members shovel the snow or cut the grass, or like every single thing is needed in the church we get used to doing, which is wonderful. But this sort of activity is often a situation where it's really heavily partnership based. So a lot of times what I encourage churches to do is think more about setting the direction, setting the vision, and that takes work. I mean, it's not without any work, but it's but you're not signing up for a decade worth of signing leases with residents, or of, managing some kind of a new social enterprise necessarily. You're very likely to be partnering with other community organizations, with developers, with whoever else. So sometimes it helps just to scale back a little bit what we're talking about doing here. And it's really the church's stewarding of our buildings and land, right? And setting the direction of it. It does still require some energy and some involvement there, but sometimes it helps to not be so weighted with like, oh my gosh, we're going to be doing all these things. Well, no, probably not. In fact, probably shouldn't be doing all those things. Let's bring along partners that are professionals at that stuff. But it is the church's role to say, here's what we want to see, One of the other things that I've found sometimes helpful is thinking a bit around legacy. So sometimes I will ask congregations, just congregational leaders, to think about 50 years from now. Let's imagine 50 years from now coming back to this spot and standing outside this church space. What's on that piece of land 50 years from now? What's happening here 50 years from now? Is the church still there? Is something else there? Is the church and something else there? And do we like what we think is happening there 50 years from now? And what can we do today to set in motion something beautiful that will be there then? And sometimes that sense of like, what can we do now that leaves something really lasting and beautiful down for decades next, can be a motivating, encouraging place to start from. Other questions? Or ideas? Anyone have any other ideas? I'm always like loving to hear new ideas that people have.
So Mark, I have a question. Since we are the presbytery gathered, if we were to amplify the ideas that you've expressed to the presbytery level, can you just dream with us for a minute about how that might look?
Yeah, I mean, say more about that just for a second to make sure I'm responding to what you're
Sure.
asking. Yeah.
So we're starting this big conversation this year after 2 years of visioning. new structures, new processes, new functions, to try to figure out, as you've been talking, what enterprises we should be about as the church gathered as this presbytery. So if you could help us to dream forward into that vision with some thoughts, that would be really helpful for all of us.
Yeah, why don't I share that in the context of what I've begun seeing a few different other judicatories doing, many presbyteries and sometimes other denominational entities. So there's a variety of responses people are taking to this. And I will just tell you that one of the benefits I get kind of is this national view is this conversation is happening literally everywhere. And so while it might feel like, oh my gosh, this is, we've all this going on, it's happening all over the place. And so you're not alone in that. But some of the things that I've seen presbyteries doing, for example, one is some presbyteries are starting to identify kind of like a full-time or a half-time person whose role it is to shepherd property transitions in the presbytery, and to support, basically to support, to be sort of, and then to try to build the networks of other partners that are going to be needed, developers, attorneys, just all the pieces that are needed to make this work happen. Somebody needs to lead that effort. And so I've seen that start to be successful in settings where that's possible. Sometimes, a presbytery will sell a property and then use the proceeds of that, not just to fund the kind of ongoing operation, which we've done in the past, but to do the new thing, like to bring on, to pay somebody for a few years to be that leader, perhaps to fund some of this training that Rooted Good and other organizations are offering, to kind of move things forward. Another thing that we've been seeing happening is cohorts, so getting cohorts of churches together. So again, our Good Futures Accelerator, we have a cohort version of that. If 5 to 6 to 8 churches want to do it together over a year. And again, sometimes if you have somebody who can lead that effort, it doesn't take a lot of work, but then the churches go through as a cohort, and then you kind of generate some conversation and energy, and it's not just one-off here and there. That's been interesting. I've seen some judicatories trying to think about how do we strategically make decisions about multiple properties at the same time. So an example, actually a slightly different example, but related here in Madison, a couple of churches, they federated, they basically not merged, but close to merged, 2 different denominations, in fact, joined together, they moved together, one church moved into the other church's building, and they kind of joined together into worship. They sold one of their buildings, the one they left. That is being redeveloped as the greenest, most energy efficient multifamily housing ever built in Madison. And then the other building, the other property is being redeveloped for workforce housing and a community center that will hold the church as an anchor tenant in the new community center. So what they did is they took 2 properties and they kind of leveraged both of them for new things. And it was critical to have the sale of the one into this green housing in order to provide funding for the development on the other. So there's a sense that doing some of this with some strategic thinking, with multiple pieces of land can be really beneficial. So those are 3 examples, right, that I can think of. And if there's more you want to ask about that, feel free.
That's great, Mark. Thank you. And I noticed that Don Greeley has a question in the chat. Do you have advice on considering merger with another congregation, which is physically on the other side of town?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on mergers. I mean, I've seen it happen more and more. I imagine there's a whole lot of issues there, right? Like, I mean, everything from practical stuff to sort of the emotional act of letting go of a space and moving to a different space. I know that in this case, with these 2 churches that I just described that federated, one of the things they did was the receiving church took a lot of the furniture and the kind of like decor of the the leaving church from their sanctuary and then incorporated into the receiving church's sanctuary as a way of hospitably bringing them in, right? So they didn't just say, show up, next week into our space exactly as is, but they said, tell us how we can change our space, and you bring along some of the beloved things from your sanctuary, and we'll incorporate them into our sanctuary, and together we'll move forward as this new entity. That kind of simple but really important, profound act was critical to making that work for those two congregations. Yeah, there's this comment here from Harry. That's absolutely right. Many churches have endowments, reserve funds, presbytery's denomination. Exactly. Waiting for what rainy day would be the question I have, right? I mean, if the rainy day's not here now, I'm not sure when it's coming. I mean, I think I think the rainy day's here, right? So that's exactly right. This is the time to put to use some of these resources that we have. And some of this sort of wealth that we have accumulated that sits kind of hidden often, and try some things with it. Yep.
Bob.
I think you're muted, Bob. Sorry. I'm sure you're saying something amazing, but let's hear it. We want to hear it.
All right, here we go. So I'm wondering, adding the, you said the statistic, the guess, that 100,000 church buildings will be sold. So there's not that many in our community, but we're in the same situation as a lot of other churches in our community. So how do you add in the dynamic of multiple church properties in multiple denominational entities, all engaged in this same process in a similar time frame?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the issues related to that I'm seeing it could be really important is conversations with cities and municipalities or towns, so it is not uncommon for even a small town to have 6 out of 8 churches closing and repurposing within the same kind of 5 to 10 year window, right? Or 4 out of 8, or some number between a quarter and 3/4 in some cases, actually, right? So that's a big deal. And I have a great passion around that question and what that's going to mean for the social fabric of our communities as that takes place. It's one thing for one church here and one church there to change, but it's another, like you said, for a whole bunch of them to change over at the same time. So in those situations, I think it's very worth our while to engage with city leaders, municipal leaders, county, whatever the right level would be, to have conversations about how can they support those transitions, how can they be aware of those transitions. In Madison here, for example, we recently updated our comprehensive plan to allow for different forms of affordable housing to be built on church land as these transitions happen. And it was a result of the city suddenly becoming aware of this reality and realizing that if they don't think about it intentionally, it's just going to kind of haphazardly happen. And I guess I would suggest that whatever the needs are of a community, if it is housing, if it is early childhood education, if it is healthcare, whatever it might be, are there ways that cities and together with church leaders can incentivize those good sorts of transitions and kind of maybe disincentivize just closing and putting fences up or selling for the highest dollar or whatnot, so that our communities are better off decade from now, not worse off. One of the things I really worry about is the loss of all this sort of semi-public space. Where do the AA groups meet and the Girl Scout troop meet, and in our city, where do we vote if all these churches are gone? We're suddenly going to have a problem with all that. So that's one reaction I have to your comment, and I think just you recognizing it is really important. Yeah.
Dude.
I think it's building on what you just said, Mark, but a lot of our congregations are elderly people who are very comfortable in their own bubble. And how do we help them? I'm hoping you have an answer here. How do you help them look beyond their walls and figure out what the needs of their neighborhood are. It's hard to visualize something when you've seen the same thing for 50 years.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It is difficult. I sort of have an answer. I'm not sure I have amazing answers, but your community listening is critical. So in our accelerator course, the very beginning part of it, a lot of time is spent on community listening, like really trying to understand what's going on around us, what are the needs around us, what are the opportunities, where is God at work already around us? And that is not a muscle that we've exercised a lot in many churches. I think in some ways the sort of worst outcome of the strength of the institutional church in the middle of the 20th century was that we didn't have to partner. We didn't have to work with other people. We sort of built our own thing and we just went on doing our thing. But we're not in that place anymore. Like nothing's going to happen anymore, really, in most of these settings if we don't work with other people, if we don't listen and engage with other people. And so, there's a lot of exercises that can help that. We include those in our course and so on to do that community listening, to try to look for partnerships, to try to reach out and understand what's going on with people around us. The other thing that I've sometimes seen that has been helpful that's really interesting is, so I often hear there's a concern amongst longtime members of churches that they want to be sure that they can have their funeral in that church, or they want to be sure that X, Y, or Z can happen in that church, right? And one of the really interesting things I've seen some churches be successful at is they will just simply commit to that and at the same time move forward on something else. So for one example, a church in San Antonio, Texas had this situation come up and they wanted to repurpose most of their property for a youth camp, youth housing for college students that are running camps in the area. I think it's what it was. And they had a really great plan, but a lot of the folks were saying, we want to be sure that the sanctuary is here and that we can have our funeral here. And they said, you know what? We're just going to commit to that. We're going to keep a version of the sanctuary here. We're going to make sure you all have your funerals here. And at the same time, we're going to move forward and redevelop the rest of this property for this other purpose. So they kind of held both together rather than just discounting it and being like, well, sorry, they listened to that need and at the same time didn't let that stop them from at the same time moving forward on something new. So I'm not sure that totally answers your question, but you're right, it is a challenge as well.
Sarah.
Hey, Mark, Sarah Dingman, Senate Executive. I really enjoyed spending time with the other Mark and Tito and other Presbyterians in Indianapolis a couple of weeks ago, I think. And I really enjoyed playing the accelerator game. I'm a gamer, and it took some really touchy subjects and made it kind of fun because there were options. And one of the pieces I liked was just doing the audit of spaces, going through a church room by room to see like what's there, what isn't there, what could it become, and also the neighborhood piece. Could you maybe just paint a picture for us what that exercise is like?
Yeah, so the way we structure the course, there's a number of points where we have these exercises in there that try to help engage the congregation and beyond just the leaders that are doing it. And we have one called I Spy, where you go out into the neighborhood and you actually use the I Spy game, like I Spy with my little eye, as a way of kind of playing a game around like, what do I see? What do we see here in the neighborhood? The Mission Possible game, I think maybe partly what you're referring to, is a game around learning how to do design thinking and to sort of think about solving problems within limits and constraints. There's an exercise where you go through and do a space audit, which actually does often generate a lot of energy, literally just walking into each space and looking around. And sometimes we haven't looked with any objectivity at our spaces in years. Like things just happen in them, right? And you go in and you say, well, what is good about this space? What's limiting about this space? But what could the space be in addition to what we're already doing here? And sometimes just in addition to is helpful language rather than instead of. So maybe not instead of what we like to do here already, but in addition to what we do here, what could happen in this building or on this land. I've seen churches exploring like a big open field of grass they have outside. Could we put some soccer fields on there and just let a local soccer club come and play games on it? And maybe we could then invite a food cart truck, if we've got a food cart operator in our community, to come on a Friday night after the soccer games are played and set up in the parking lot. And then we have a fun night where people are playing soccer and then having food. There's so many possibilities that just by just walking around and thinking about what could happen here, and then listening to what folks in the community are asking about, it can get pretty exciting, in that respect. I don't know if I quite responded to what you're looking for, Sarah, but yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
And
Can you hear me now?
yes,
Going back to Stu's remark, something we did here in Marion was participate in a group called Boots on the Ground. And it is 3 or 4 churches gather once a month, a representative from the church. Then we have Red Cross, United Way, Salvation Army, Southern Illinois Coalition for the Housing, even University of Illinois Extension representatives. It's just probably 20 different entities that gather once a month and then have open conversation about, we need more protein at the food pantries, and somebody needs to open up another breakfast bar because it's closed on the weekend over at the other place. There's just conversation within Marion of the players in Marion, and that gives you ideas about how you can engage. So I would think that every community may or should have some kind of a network where they could get together with those bigger Red Cross, United Way, Salvation Army, people that are all working in this same direction. It's really given us some ideas. And I love your soccer field idea, by the way. We've got an open lot that we could put up goals and have people come to the fellowship hall for refreshments.
Yeah, it's easy and relatively cheap, way of, doing something new. I love that, Dan. That's a great description of exactly the sort of community conversations. And sometimes churches can join what's already there or others lead it. And sometimes the church can be the convener of it. It depends on it depends a lot on the community, but I love that. That's exactly what the kind of thing we need to see more of. Yep.
neat.
Can you talk a little bit about strengths and weaknesses and such of denominations? Post-denominationalism and conversations like that are happening. And just in general, it's come up a number of times with partnerships across denominations. So what are some trends that we're seeing around denominations?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on that. And I'm always trying to be careful of postulating on things I'm not an expert on. But I think, as you're noting, there is shifting going on. My sense of it is that there's a lot of activity sort of outside denominational structures, generally locally, regionally and locally, right? So within a particular community. And that makes a lot of sense, I think, because again, as we start to get outside our own silos and our own kind of walls, literally and figuratively, we're going to end up connecting and partnering with whoever we're aligned with in those efforts. And that could definitely, it very often is other churches of different denominations. Certainly our denominational structures are challenged, on lots of levels, and it's been going on for a long time. And so there's just limits to what our denominational structures are able to do as well. Although it is interesting that we're going to be entering a phase where many denominational entities like presbyteries are going to have influx of money from the sale of things and from the disposal of property. And the question I sometimes ask is, what are we going to do with that? Or what are we going to just keep going like we did and just sort of keep the same model? I kind of hope not. I kind of hope we're going to do something new with that influx of money as it comes. So I'm not sure I really answered your question there, but I guess in some ways I would say we go where the Spirit's leading, Nothing wrong with the denominational structures and supports that we have, but also let's not be limited by that in any way either, and let's see where God is at work and participate in that. If it's across denomination, great. Yeah.
Are there other questions? Leslie? You're still muted, Leslie.
How about now?
That's great.
Okay. I've heard a couple of good ideas about how to get started looking at your community and seeing what's here and what can be done with the community and with organizations that are community organizations already here. And I think that's the big problem is how do we get started? How do we get started with this? And that's what I think what we need help with is the execution of these good ideas is, I think, easier than coming up with the ideas.
Mhm.
And so that's the big problem I see.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're actually right. That's, I think, very insightful. It's a good reminder too. The execution is usually not as hard as the coming up with it and the setting of the direction. And often we get the order wrong. So I often see we dive right into property questions or call the real estate agent or call the developer or call the whatever. But in fact, it's the front end work that's most important. It's thinking about what is it that we're trying to do? Why are we trying to do it? Well, how does this connect to our mission? You know, again, not to just continually beat the same dead horse, but the accelerator course that we designed at Rooted Good, that's exactly what it's for. It's a 9-month process where it helps. It's a process that's set up to literally help you get to an idea. That's what it does. So the end result is an idea or two around how to think differently about the use of buildings and land. And it includes steps like reflecting on where have we come up with new ideas in the past, like kind of reminding ourselves of how we've done it, how we've come up with innovation in the past and new ideas, and then takes through all these different exercises that exercise our muscle. I often think about it a little bit like exercise. Like you don't want to go to the gym for 5 hours if you haven't been to the gym for a while. You know, diving straight into some massive thing is a bit overwhelming. You want to start somewhere with a little bit more of a manageable step, right? And so we got to sort of re-exercise those muscles of innovation and experimentation. You know, rather than perhaps a massive, huge effort around like turning your kitchen or something into a food ministry or an entrepreneurship ministry, maybe invite a food cart, like I noted, onto your parking lot for three Friday nights in the summer, once a month, and just start with a little thing and then figure out what that takes. Are there permits needed for that? Are there, you know, what's it like to build a relationship with a food cart entrepreneur, and what does that produce, and what do you learn from it? And if it doesn't work, there's not a whole lot lost because it's just not that big, right? But just starting with little things like that, like let's try that for a little bit, and then you kind of start building those muscles around it, and then the bigger things could come from there if they're relevant.
So how can we get into this course that you're talking about? That I think that would be a good place for us to start.
Yeah, so I'll put a link in here. I mean, Sarah's well aware of it. I unfortunately was ill and not able to attend that thing in Indianapolis with our group, so we are working with with a whole bunch of people across the denomination to customize these resources in this course. But the course basically is very similar today as it will be in the summer. I just put a link in here. And with the Presbyterian support, it's half price. And essentially you just sign up for it, and then you'll receive all the material that you need in the mail within a couple weeks, and then you can dive right into it. And the way it works is you put together a team of about 4 to 5 leaders within the congregation. They don't need to be session members necessarily. You might want, a couple session members. If you have a pastor at the moment, you probably have the pastor on there, and then a couple other people that are not maybe serving in current leadership. Depends on the nature of your church. And then they get together and they work through the steps of the course, and they have sessions together where they watch some videos, and then there's these exercises that are used to engage the larger congregation, whatever size it is, really, in conversation and helping move it forward and ending up with an idea. So there's a link in the chat there, and you can actually sign up right now if you want, but it just gets you underway with something. Yeah.
Leslie,
Yeah,
I will make sure that those links are on the big conversation page, so we can get back to them easily.
okay, good. Thank you, Stu.
Website.
Yeah, and this is really fabulous that we have this denominational partnership, which is actually a representation of the kind of leveraging that Mark's talking about. It is really partnering together. Rachel, you will be our last question.
Okay, Mark, you mentioned pulling together a team of people outside the church who can help with these ideas, understanding that the church really needs to work on the mission. Is there something, are there questions? Are there ways to prepare these community helpers, contractors, lawyers to work with congregations in this way, so that I know working with contractors can be really difficult sometimes. So are there things maybe that do you recommend them taking the accelerator course? I'll let you finish.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. First of all, I would always say it's beneficial to start with to wait on some of those questions like a bit, right? So to start with the idea generation phase and the designing phase and the thinking phase, and then to move from there into those relationships, because you just never know what you're going to need until you really get to idea, right? So, but yeah, what you're describing a little bit, I think, is like, how do we educate these other partners on working with churches? And it is a bit of a back and forth, right? It is a bit of a mutual, like, they need to understand. And we actually have a tool, how to develop well, that's designed for the church, but also for developers to understand how churches think. That's specific to developers. That would be a little bit different than contractors. I think that what I've been seeing is that a lot of times it's just a lot of conversations, and then you see where there's alignment, and you kind of try to come alongside where there's alignment in terms of vision. And then those folks are usually willing to learn, right? All of the resources we produce at Really Good have a lot of questions in them, like ask these questions of a developer, ask these questions to see if you have that alignment. And then listen, and then ask around who else has done it, are other churches doing it? This is the one advantage of the flip side of a lot of these churches happening at the same time. We're all figuring it out. So maybe the Methodist church down the street is a little bit further along, or has had one extra conversation than our Presbyterian church. And so let's ask them who they talk to. Do they know a lawyer that would be helpful? Do they know a contractor that understands and gets it? And just see, and then share with each other. You might know the lawyer and they might know the contractor, and then you can help each other, So I think that kind of a dynamic can emerge.
Well, thank you, Mark. We are deeply grateful for your presence with us and for all this wonderful information that you've shared with us, and the innovative ideas that will prompt, I hope, new visions and new ways to be church together. Thank you.
It's been great to be with you, and what a great set of questions and thoughts you all have. So I really am pleased with that, and I'm excited for you all, and it's fun to hear what you're thinking about.